I am looking out the window of a small clinic in Rome, watching the Tiber River move beneath the bridge, and I still cannot make sense of the fact that I am breathing. 6 days ago, my heart stopped for 2 minutes and 19 seconds while I was kneeling in the chapel for our evening rosary. They tell me it was a sudden collapse, a failure of the muscle that no one saw coming in a 34-year-old woman. I am sharing this with you now because I was told that the time after April is already written, and I have a responsibility to tell you what I saw before the month begins. If this message finds you, please type "ready" in the comments, subscribe to the channel, because what is coming requires us to be awake. My name is Sister Maria Bianchi, and until last Monday, my world was the size of a convent garden and the pages of my prayer book. Now, the world feels like a house of glass that is about to meet a stone. The last thing I remember of the chapel was the smell of beeswax and the weight of the wooden beads in my palm. I was on the third sorrowful mystery when the air in my lungs simply vanished. There was no pain, just a sudden, heavy silence that pressed down on my shoulders until my forehead hit the cold marble floor. I didn't feel the sisters rushing to me or the paramedics lifting my body. I was already somewhere else. It wasn't a tunnel or a dark hallway. It felt like I had been living my entire life inside a heavy woolen coat, and someone finally helped me take it off. I was light. I was standing in a place that felt more solid than the ground I'm currently sitting on. I looked down and saw my body on the floor of the chapel. It looked like a discarded habit, empty and pale. I felt no attachment to it, only a quiet observation of the clinical details, the way my veil had slipped, the way my fingers were still curled around the rosary. Then the light changed. It wasn't like the sun or a lamp. It was a living presence. It was warm, but not like heat. It was warm like the feeling of being understood. I turned around and he was there. I didn't need to ask who he was. My knees hit the ground instinctively, not out of fear, but because every cell in my being recognized its creator. He didn't look like the statues in our cathedral. His eyes held a depth that made my 34 years of life feel like a single heartbeat. I looked at him and I felt ashamed of every small, selfish thought I had ever kept in the corners of my mind. But he just reached out and touched my shoulder. The love that flooded through me was so intense it felt like it would break me apart. I started to cry, not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of being seen and loved anyway. He didn't speak with a mouth. The words formed inside my chest, vibrating through my bones. He said, "Maria, you have prayed for the world. Now I will show you what the world has chosen." I find myself wondering why he chose me, a simple sister who has never traveled further than the outskirts of Rome. I am not a politician or a general. I am just someone who knows how to keep a vigil. Why show these things to a person with no platform? Perhaps it's because those with the most noise in their lives can't hear the frequency of what is coming. My faith has always been a quiet thing, a steady rhythm of bells and chanting, but what I saw in that light was a violent disruption of everything I thought was stable. He took me to a high place, and I saw the earth. It wasn't a map or a globe. It was a living, breathing spiritual reality. I saw Israel. It looked like a sanctuary lamp flickering in a vast, dark cathedral. The flame was small, wounded, and bruised, but it would not go out. Around it, I saw thick, black clouds swirling, moving with a calculated, ancient intelligence. I saw threads of shadow stretching from Iran and Russia, weaving together to form a net around the small light. These weren't just soldiers or missiles. They were spirits of old hatred that had put on modern uniforms. The voice told me that what we see on the news is only the surface of a much deeper war. He showed me that Israel is a wounded ember that keeps reigniting no matter how many times it is stepped on. I watched as the escalations in the Middle East began to change. I saw the calendar turn to April, and the quality of the conflict shifted. It became contagious. I saw a strike happen, then a response, and then a line was crossed that pulled Turkey and other nations into the circle. It felt like watching a fuse burn toward a barrel of powder. The West was watching, but they were paralyzed. I saw America and Europe looking on with a strange, dull confusion. It reminded me of a patient I once visited who had a brain injury. They could see the danger, but they couldn't find the words or the will to move their limbs. The moral nervous system of the world was being intentionally numbed. The voice said, "They are reading the news. But they are not reading the signs. The time of the Gentiles is leaning into its final hour, and they are distracted by the dust. I saw the borders of these countries glowing with a dark heat. The tension wasn't just political. It was as if the earth itself was groaning under the weight of the secrets being kept in those war rooms. I saw leaders in Russia and Iran speaking in whispers, but their shadows were massive, stretching across the maps like predatory birds. Everything was being orchestrated to lead to a single moment of total exhaustion for humanity. I felt a coldness settle in my spirit as I watched the threads tighten. I am sitting here now, 6 days after my heart stopped, looking at the date on the calendar. April is so close. I can still feel the vibration of that voice in my teeth. It told me that the peace the world is about to be offered is not the peace he gives. It is a peace designed to be accepted by people who are too tired to care about the cost. I need you to understand that what I saw wasn't a possibility. It was a preview. The architect of the darkness is already standing in the wings, waiting for the stage to be cleared. The weight of the world's exhaustion was the next thing he showed me. It felt like a physical pressure, a gray fog that had settled over every continent. People were not just tired, they were depleted. I saw mothers in America crying over the cost of bread, and fathers in Europe staring at empty heating tanks with a hollow kind of despair. The wars in the Middle East had drained the hope out of the soil. And in that vacuum of soul-crushing fatigue, I saw an offer being made. It wasn't a military conquest or a violent takeover. It was much more dangerous than that. It was an invitation. I saw a figure emerge, not a monster with horns, but a man who radiated a terrifying kind of calm. His voice was like a frequency that hit the exact note of the world's desperation. He spoke of a global covenant, a way to finally end the divisions that had bled the earth dry for centuries. He promised a unified system where no child would go hungry and no nation would have to fear its neighbor. It sounded like the kingdom of God, but when I looked closer, the light around it was wrong. It was a cold, artificial light, like the glow of a screen in a dark room. The voice in my chest grew stern. They are choosing comfort and calling it peace, he told me. They are choosing control and calling it unity. I watched as nations began to sign their names to this new order. It happened slowly at first, one reasonable concession at a time. I saw a new financial architecture being built, a digital grid that connected every transaction to a single point of authority. It was presented as efficiency, as a way to protect the vulnerable from the collapsing old world. But I saw the truth of it. To buy food, to access medicine, to hold a job, you had to align yourself with this system. It required a mark of loyalty, a sign of participation that was both a digital reality and a spiritual seal. As a nun who has taken a vow of poverty, I have always relied on the providence of the convent. But what I saw was a different kind of dependence. This was a total surrender of the soul in exchange for a full stomach. I felt a sharp pang of grief when I realized how many people would walk into this trap simply because they were too tired to fight anymore. They weren't being asked to hate God. They were just being asked to prioritize their own survival above His word. I saw a line forming that stretched across the globe, and at the end of that line was a door that locked from the inside. Every few moments, I find myself touching the small wooden cross that hangs around my neck, trying to ground myself in this clinic room. The doctors here talk about hypoxic events and neurological echoes, but they weren't there. They didn't see the way the cathedrals of Europe began to change in the shadow of this new world order. That was the third vision he gave me, and it was the one that broke my heart the most. I saw the great stones of France and the modern steeples of the United States, and I realized they were becoming empty shells. I saw the tabernacles, the gold boxes where we keep the real presence of Christ, and they were open and vacant. The light that usually burns beside them, the sanctuary lamp that signals God is home, had been extinguished. The buildings were still full of people, but the air inside was different. It didn't smell like incense or prayer anymore. It smelled like a theater. I saw priests and ministers standing on stages that used to be altars, speaking words that had been carefully edited so as not to offend the new global system. In these churches, Jesus was still mentioned, but he had been turned into a metaphor. He was a symbol of inclusion, a champion of resilience, a historical teacher of kindness. They had stripped him of his blood, his cross, and his resurrection. They had made him small enough to fit into the pockets of the new order. I saw a generation of young people in America sitting in these pews, and they looked so hungry. They were being fed stones and told it was bread. They were being given motivational speeches and told it was the gospel. I saw a church in a large American city where the cross had been moved to a storage closet because it was deemed too triggering for the new inclusive atmosphere. In its place was a screen showing images of global harmony. The voice said, "They have traded the living water for a mirror. They worship themselves and use my name to bless it." I felt the weight of that betrayal. It wasn't a sudden apostasy. It was a slow, polite retreat from the truth. I watched as the pulpits became platforms for the global covenant. The leaders of the church were telling their flocks that the new digital mark was an act of neighborly love, a way to ensure the common good. They were using the language of the Bible to lead people away from the Word of God. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. I wanted to scream, to tell them to look at the empty tabernacle, to see that the guest of honor had already left the room. I think about the sisters I live with, women who have spent 50 years scrubbing floors and chanting the Psalms, and I wonder if they know how fragile the institution has become. We think the walls of the church are made of stone, but they are made of faith. And when the faith is replaced by values, the walls become nothing but dust. The darkness was thickening over the map of Europe, but it wasn't a darkness that came from the sky. It was a darkness that rose up from the floorboards of the sanctuaries themselves. I saw a woman in a beautiful hat sitting in a pew in Paris, smiling as a choir sang a song about universal brotherhood. She looked perfectly comfortable, perfectly safe. But above her, the spiritual roof of the building had already collapsed. She was sitting in a ruin and didn't even know it. The light of the world was being gathered up, withdrawn from the places that no longer wanted it, leaving behind nothing but an expensive hollow theater. But while the grand buildings were going dark, I saw something else that the world would never notice. Scattered across the map of America and tucked into the ancient hills of Italy, I saw tiny sparks of fire. They weren't in cathedrals. They were in basements, in small farmhouses, and in the back rooms of ordinary apartments. These were small communities of people who had seen the global covenant for what it was and had chosen to walk away from the system before the door locked. I watched them from above, and I realized that these small, unheralded groups were the only thing keeping the world from being swallowed entirely by the shadow. I saw a family in the USA sitting around a wooden table, sharing a single loaf of bread and a bowl of soup. There was no screen in the room, no connection to the new digital grid. They were praying, and as they spoke, I saw a thread of light rise from that table and pierce through the gray fog of the world. It wasn't a psychological comfort. It was structural. I saw these prayers interweaving with others from across the globe, forming an actual dam, a barrier of light that was holding back a flood of darkness that I cannot describe. The voice told me, as long as even these few watch and pray, I hold back the flood. These are the most powerful people on earth, and the world does not even know their names. It changed everything I thought I knew about my own life in the convent. I used to think prayer was a duty, a beautiful tradition we kept to honor God. But seeing it from that dimension, I realized prayer is load-bearing. It is the only thing keeping the roof of reality from collapsing on our heads. I saw these people memorizing the Gospels because they knew a day was coming when the printed word would be hunted. I saw them learning how to heal with plants and how to grow food in secret gardens, not because they were afraid, but because they were preparing to be the hands and feet of Christ when the system finally turned on the faithful. The voice gave me a specific command for these small groups. Tell them to gather before they are forced to gather, he said. The isolation the new order offers is beautiful and fatal. Choose the inconvenience of real community over the comfort of digital connection. Bear one another's burdens with your actual hands. I saw a woman in a cold room in Europe reciting the Psalms from memory to a group of children, and I saw the words create an actual perimeter of peace around them that the darkness could not penetrate. It was like a key that opened a physical protection I didn't know existed. Then, I was brought to a place where I saw two paths stretching out from a single point. It was the choice being offered to every soul before April concludes. The first path was wide and paved with gold. It looked like a modern city street, clean and efficient. People were walking along it with ease, their digital marks glowing with a soft, reassuring blue light. They were talking about universal peace and global harmony. It was the path of least resistance, the path of comfort. But I looked at the end of that road, and it just stopped. There was no bridge. It led straight into an abyss that was waiting with a patient, hungry silence. The second path was hard to even look at. It was narrow and choked with briars and sharp stones. I saw people on this path who were bleeding, whose clothes were torn, and who were being mocked by those on the golden road. This was the path of the cross. It was the path of those who refused the digital mark, who refused the global covenant, and who clung to the real Jesus instead of the symbolic one. The world called this path extremism. They called these people enemies of progress. I saw families being separated and fathers being led away in the middle of the night. But as I looked at that hard path, I saw a light at the end of it that made the golden road look like a gutter. It was the light of the King. The voice said, "The world will call the first path love and the second path extremism. I call the first path death dressed in comfort and the second path life dressed in suffering." I understood then that the global covenant isn't just a political agreement. It is a spiritual filter. It is designed to separate those who love their lives more than the truth from those who love the truth more than their lives. Then the great night he had been showing me finally reached its end. I saw the darkness over Israel, Russia, and America become so thick it felt like the earth was being buried alive. And then, in a single moment, it broke. It wasn't a gradual sunrise. It was a violent, beautiful shattering of the sky. One moment it was pitch black, and the next, the heavens were being pulled back like a heavy curtain. I saw the sky split open from the east to the west, and I saw him. I saw the homecoming. I saw those small communities, the hidden intercessors, and the families from the briar-choked path being gathered. I saw the relief on their faces, a joy so sharp it felt like a physical sting. Every cost they had paid, every meal they had missed, and every tear they had shed in the cold and the dark was suddenly, retroactively worth it. I saw them being caught up into a light that had no beginning and no end. And then I saw those on the golden road, the ones who had accepted the universal peace, and they were simply not there. They had chosen a mirror, and they were left with nothing but their own reflections. The light began to recede with the gentleness of a tide going out. I felt the weight of my habit return to me, the coldness of the hospital sheets, and the dull ache in my chest where the paramedics had worked to restart my heart. I opened my eyes at 2:19 in the afternoon, and the first thing I saw was the crucifix on the clinic wall. My throat was dry, and my hands were shaking, but I knew what I had to do. I asked for a pen before the nurse could even check my IV. I told her I didn't care about the rest. I had to write down the briefing I was sent back to deliver. I am a simple nun, and I know that many will listen to this and see only the hypoxic hallucinations of a 34-year-old woman. But I know what I saw. I know the quality of that light, and I know the urgency of that voice. The time after April is coming, and the global covenant is already being prepared. Do not trade the real Jesus for the comfortable one. Do not take the mark, no matter how much they tell you it is for the common good. Gather with your brothers and sisters, memorize the word until it lives inside your bones. I'm grateful you stayed with me all the way to the end of this testimony. If you're still here, I believe this message reached your heart for a reason. Before you go, I ask you to do something simple but meaningful. Write a comment and tell me which country you're watching from, so I can keep you and your nation in my prayers. If this message spoke to you, follow the channel and activate the notifications so you'll know whenever a new testimony or revelation is shared. And please pass this message on to a few people you care about, a friend, a family member, someone who might need hope today. Sometimes a single share is enough to touch a life, awaken faith, and lead a heart back toward Christ. He is coming, and he will not be long.